Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. I hope you guys are ready for episode 2 in the Corporate Pilot Professional series. Today we are doing lesson 2 and we're going to cover several different key features of the Citation 550 aircraft. Now, I know most of you can probably get in this airplane right now, start it up, taxi out, take off, land, and really have no problems at all. And that's fine, and a lot of people do that for enjoyment and they get enjoyment out of it, and that's totally fine and that's good on them. However, there's a lot of nuances and little things about the aircraft operation that are going to be missed unless you get some instruction. So that's where I'm going to step in and try to give you guys some of my knowledge on operating this aircraft and help you guys understand some of these systems a little bit more thoroughly. So the object of today's lesson is to take you from a cold and dark, get you all the way out to the runway ready to go, just as I would do it in real life as if we were going on a corporate jet trip together. So we can see here in front of us now that the aircraft static elements have been removed, our pre-flight has been completed, and we're ready to start the aircraft and get our pre-flight checks complete. Now, one thing to take note is I'm going to leave the GPU cart plugged into the aircraft, and we're going to talk about this for engine starting when we get to that part of the video. So let's hop into the cockpit right now, and I'm going to go ahead and just close up the door. Main door is closed. Beautiful. Now, I'm going to be going through a checklist here, the Citation 2 S550 checklist. This is a checklist available on my Discord. If you go to the Downloads and Documents section, check the pinned messages, and you'll be able to find this PDF file. You can drop it into your Avi tab and go from there. I'm eventually trying to get this into a C-list file so that you can run it with X checklist, but that takes a lot of programming, and I just don't really have a time for it right now. Maybe one of you guys out there who are familiar with programming, we can work together and I can get you, we can do some testing and we can try to get this into an X checklist file. I think it would be really handy for this aircraft. Now, I know a lot of you will skip the before start checklist on this document here, which is totally fine. There's really no reason to do it. It's not going to hinder the performance of the aircraft in X-plane, but I'm going to use this checklist as a guide to kind of teach you some systems, and that way if you really want to simulate a real-world operation, you can go ahead and run right through it. Now, a lot of the items on this checklist would have been accomplished in what we call a flow pattern. So the pilot flying would come in here and he would do his flow, make sure all his checks are done, and then when we're ready to go, first officer would go ahead and read through the checklist and verify everything has been checked. So there may be a few items out of order, such as when the battery should be turned on and turned off, but for the most part, it's a good guide in getting the aircraft ready to go. Let's dive right into it. Before start checklist. Pre-flight inspection has been completed with flashlight is on board and checked. That is a required item in the aircraft. Fire extinguisher aboard checked. Microphones, headsets, oxygen mask aboard. So make sure you got everything that we need as pilots and crew members up front. Documents and manuals, also very important. Just like pilots, airplanes have logbooks too. Sometimes they're referred to as the can. We want to make sure that is on board in case we get ramp checked. Oxygen quantity, this is where we start moving around the cockpit. So we know from our last episode, the oxygen quantity is over here on the right-hand side, first officer panel. That is checked and in the green. Circuit breakers checked in. So we'd want to check right, check left, make sure all the circuit breakers are in. Anti-ice, de-ice switches off. So lower left-hand side of the pilot panel, we're going to be coming down here a lot. They are all in the off position. Control locks removed. We can move the flight controls freely. Generators, except for GPU start into the generator position. So this is where we're first going to have our little lesson in generator knowledge on the Citation 2 aircraft. The Citation 2, when you start up engines and a generator receives power and the relay is closed and it is powering its respective buses, that generator will now take priority in engine starting even if a ground power cart is connected. So if we leave both generators in the on position and we do a ground cart start, we're going to start engine 2 first. It will start up on ground power, which is good. But then when we go to start engine number 1, it's going to do a cross generator start and not even going to use the GPU. The reason for that is once this relay is closed and supplying power to the aircraft, the ground power unit no longer takes precedence. So in order to do a true ground cart start, you would have to have both generators in the off position, start both engines, and then turn on your generators and remove the ground power. Now, that's all fine and dandy, and a lot of guys do it that way. The only problem with that a little bit, if you really like your ramp crew, you don't want them have to go under this engine when it is operating. So what we like to do, what I did personally, I would start engine number 2 with the ground cart. Once I got a good start and I turned the generator on, I would say, okay, you're good to disconnect the ground power. The ground crew member would come over here, disconnect the ground power cart, come back to the front of the aircraft, give me the thumbs up, say GPU is disconnected, and then I would come back into the cockpit and do a generator assisted cross start for engine number 1. Now, you can do a battery start as well. You don't even need a GPU card. The aircraft is designed and can do a battery start no problem, and it can do it multiple times in a trip. It's not a big deal at all. However, most operators, and especially private owners, they like to save as much money as they can, and they don't want to drain parts of the aircraft that don't have to be drained. In particular, your battery. Batteries are very expensive, and they're even more expensive for airplanes. So to help with battery life, it is always kind of recommended to do a ground power start if you can and if it's available. But if there is no GPU available, that's not a problem. You can do a battery start just fine. All right, so for this start, we are going to do a GPU start. So we're going to go ahead and leave our generators in the off position for right now. Fuel boost pumps to normal. Come back down here to our lower left-hand side. We're going to put our fuel boost pumps into the normal position. Normal position is fine for engine start. It will provide the adequate fuel for engine starting on an automatic sequence. You do not need to put them in on or override them. All right, so a little bit more in-depth discussion about the electric boost pumps. The electric boost pumps do not need to be manually turned on for engine start because their activation is dependent and automatically connected to the throttle latch positions on the throttle quadrant. With the throttle levers in the idle cutoff position, they are de-energized and cannot be activated when the electric boost pumps are in their normal position. As soon as the throttle latch comes open and the throttle goes above the idle cutoff gate and the electric boost pump is in the normal position, they will be energized and provide sufficient fuel pressure for engine start and crossfeeding. This is the reason why we do not need to manually activate them prior to engine start. Ignitions, norm. Same with the ignitions. Don't need to put them in the on position. Norm position is fine for engine start. Now, what are the ignitions and what is the ignition system? Each engine incorporates dual exciter units and 2 igniters. The exciter unit converts battery or generator input to high voltage DC current, direct current, store it momentarily until enough given energy is reached, and then it will discharge in spark form through the igniters. The wiring in the system is such that a malfunction of one igniter or exciter will not affect normal operation of the other. Now, in the cockpit, we have 2 igniter switches, right-hand and left-hand ignition switches. In norm, function is automatic during start and with engine anti-ice selected. Moving the throttle to idle after depressing the start button activates engine ignition until it is terminated automatically at approximately 39% turbine N2. Continuous ignition, however, will occur anytime the respective engine anti-ice or ignition switch is on. You'll notice that your ignitions are on when a small green light above each ignition switch illuminates when both exciters are receiving electrical power. If one does fail, however, ignition will be available from the remaining igniter, but the light will not illuminate it when it is selected. Crossfeed off. Make sure our crossfeed is in the off position. If you are crossfeeding, you'll see here left tank, right tank. And what is happening, you're basically taking a right tank to the left engine, or you're going to take a left tank to the right engine. This line symbolizes a connection between the tank and engine respectively. So for engine starting, we're going to keep that right in the middle and keep it off. Gyro slave switch auto. So we're going to come down here, left-hand gyro slave switch. We're going to keep it in the auto position. Normal for the left hand or right hand is just to keep it in the left-hand position. All that means is we're going to slave the gyro to the left-hand side of the primary pilot. Standby gyro on, verify power off. So the standby gyro, if we zoom back out here and look back down to our aircraft, let me hide the yoke. Standby gyro switch is located over here. This is the standby gyro over here in the front dash. To do this test properly, you do have to turn the battery switch on. It's not in the checklist. So what we would do is we would move this into the test position. We would see that the gyro is flagged. Go ahead and put it back into the normal position, and it is working just fine. So we go ahead and remove that. All right, and your fasten seatbelt, your passenger safety sign here. Again, you'd have to turn the battery switch on, and you would do a passenger safety, basically a seatbelt position off, and then passenger safety position. No sounds associated with this sound pack, unfortunately, but I think they're, depending on the aircraft load, you could have a sound in the back. All right, anti-skid is off. That is located over here by the gear lever that's in the off position. Cabin pressure rate control set. We're going to go over cabin pressurization in depth in a later video, but what I want you to understand right now is the basic selection of cabin aircraft control for the Citation is going to be right here on the cabin controller knob. Now, how this works is we have 3 different gauges here. We have a differential pressure gauge and a cabin altitude gauge. So this is really 2 gauges here in one. The cabin altitude, the altitude that the passengers are going to feel that they are at, is on the outer ring scale here. The differential pressure of the aircraft is located on this green scale here. That is the difference of pressure between the outside and inside of the aircraft. The second gauge over here is your cabin climb in feet per minute. Essentially, look at this as a vertical speed indicator, but it's for the cabin. This will tell you how fast and how slow the cabin is either climbing or descending. So climbing at 500 feet, climbing at 1,000 feet per minute, or descending 500, descending 1,000. The third gauge over here is our cabin controller selector. This is how we set the pressurization for this aircraft. There are two windows here on the same scale. So we have cabin altitude and aircraft altitude. Cabin altitude is located on the outer ring. That is what the cabin is going to pressurize at. So for instance, if I put a 4 in the middle right here, that means I'm setting my cabin altitude pressurization system to pressurize the cabin at 4,000 feet. So if I'm in the airplane, I'm going to feel that I'm at 4,000 feet elevation. Consequently, the aircraft flight level is going to be about 220. So the way to properly set this is to determine your aircraft cruise altitude first, and then you'll know where the aircraft is going to be pressurized at. So if I set the cabin altitude window here, I know the aircraft is going to be a cruise altitude of 300, and the cabin is going to be roughly 8,000 feet in atmospheric conditions. All right, after looking at our cabin pressurization, we know our throttles are in the cutoff position. Engine sync is off. We'll talk about that in depth later as well, but we're going to keep that in the off position. Windshield bleed valves closed. These are two rotary knobs here in front of the first officer's knee. Make sure they're in the closed position. Battery switch, battery check 24 volt minimum. So let's come down here. We'll turn on the battery to the aircraft. Go ahead and let it power up. We want to make sure that we have a 24 volt minimum. So to check that, we'll come down here to our lower left-hand panel. I'm going to put my voltage selector on battery, and I can see that the battery is fully charged at 24 volts. AC power and master avionics on. So let's go ahead and turn on the AC power and then avionics power. As we turn those switches on, you might get some spurious cautions, but now the cockpit has come to life and you are ready to continue on with your pre-flight checks. One other note here to look, we can tell if we are connected to a ground power cart by using the voltage selector. If I go to the right-hand generator and turn the right-hand generator on, I can see that the aircraft at the right generator has 28 volts DC power. That means there is a ground power cart connected. If I were to remove the ground power cart, notice my volts drop back down to 24 volt DC. That's a quick way to check to make sure that you have a good ground power cart. It's very important to check this because sometimes you might get a ground power cart that doesn't put out enough power, and if you try to do an engine start on the GPU and you don't have a good output here, you may have a hot start and you may have starting issues with your aircraft. So always want to make sure we check our DC volts and amps, especially make sure we want to check to see the output of the ground power cart. So let's go ahead and turn that back off. We'll go back into battery mode. We know we have 24 volts right there. Continuing on with our checklist now, we're going to do the rotary test. So rotary test knob, again, we're going to come back down here and I'm going to be moving this knob into a series of different positions. Basically, we're going to check a bunch of different cautions and enunciations that the aircraft will call out. You're probably going to do this on the first flight of the day, or maybe the first, every other flight. You're not going to do it every leg unless your operator requires it of you. So a couple of big ones to check is the first one to the left. That's going to give us all of our lights here. We're going to do the terrain awareness test.
Terrain awareness system passed. Terrain awareness test complete.
Terrain awareness test is complete. We can see that all of our caution lights are illuminated. All right, if we go 2 clicks over to the overspeed, we'll be able to hear the overspeed warning in the aircraft. So that is the overspeed alarm. We know that's working. We also have a windshield tint switch. If we go all the way to the left, what this does is it illuminates the caution here, letting us know that, hey, windshield air heat, there's a problem with that. If I go ahead and remove that, you'll see that it goes away. So that's the base test on the left. If we go to the right, we're going to test a couple of different things here. Gear unsafe is 2 clicks to the right. Fire warning, 1 click to the right. This is a big one here. We've got our bottles armed. Left and right engine fires are illuminated. And we have Betty calling out saying we have left and right engine fire. You can go all the way over to battery temp, which is 3 clicks to the right. This is a dangerous one. If you do get this is a hot battery temp. This is technically an emergency in this aircraft. One of the only emergencies I've ever had in the Citation was a battery overtemp situation. You can see this is located here on the cautionary panel in red. That means it is a master warning. It's not a caution, it is a warning. It is a serious situation. Thermal runaway is a real deal, and battery temp is not to be messed around with. So that's the battery temp. After I had that emergency, I always made sure I did that check, make sure everything was working. Now you can also go all the way over to the stick shaker, and then we turn that one off because it's very violent, very loud, and if you have passengers in the back, you definitely don't want to be doing this test because it can make them uncomfortable, especially if they are nervous flyers. So our rotary test has been complete. Parking brake is set. It's right here, this little pull knob. We know the parking brake is set. Landing gear down, 3 green, no flags. Engine instruments, no flags. Elevator trim disc check connected. Now, I don't think you can actually test that in this aircraft, so we're going to skip that one. But just know that your trim wheel and your electric trim, perfect. Works just fine. Airspeed bugs set. So we would set our airspeed bugs depending on where you wanted to go. Now, the Bravo that I flew had a slightly different glass layout here where you can actually select V speeds. But what a lot of guys did in this aircraft is just set your climb out speed. So this airplane, typically a very good rate of climb is going to give you about 180 knots. That's a pretty decent climb out. Now you can go faster. You can do 200 if you want to go a little bit faster, a little bit shallower. But if you're looking for a good performance and a nice climb gradient, 180 knots clean is really gonna get you up and out of the way. Fuel quantity sufficient and balanced. We'd come over here to our fuel quantity. We've got 1,500 aside, 3,000 pounds total. Perfect. GPS FMC programmed and flight plan filed. So you would do your flight planning in your box here, file your flight plan, and then you're good to go. After that's all done, go ahead and shut off the avionics power, shut all that off, and then go ahead and turn the battery off because you don't want to waste unnecessary juice. Now, of course, if you're connected to the ground power cart, you don't need to worry about that. You can keep the airplane running, have the air conditioning on, get the cabin nice and cool. But if you don't have a ground power cart where you are, you want to be careful of that battery because it will drain on you, and then you could have problems starting the engines. All right, now that we have our pre-flight checklist completed, the doors are closed, GPU is connected, chocks are in, everything is ready to go. Let's go ahead and continue with the before starting engines checklist. Kind of gets cut off here on this PDF. Just go ahead and hit the next page, and then it will be on top of that there. All right, so chocks have been removed, seats and pedals adjusted, a beacon navigation lights on. So come down here, we're going to get our battery switch on. We're doing a GPU start on engine 2, so we're going to leave our generators off. We're going to go ahead and turn our beacon light in the on position over here, and our navigation lights as well, which are over here on the lower left hand side. Standby gyro on, so that is in the on position. AC power and master avionics off, so these are both off. You do not want to have your avionics on during engine start because any interruption or overvoltage situation can damage the sensitive equipment on the aircraft, and you can have a really expensive repair on your hands. So make sure your AC and avionics power are off during engine start, whether it's a ground start or a battery start. Air conditioning off. So our air conditioning switches, we haven't talked too much about those over there. They're in the off position. Cabin door locked, lights out. So let's come here. We're going to look at our caution panel. Now real quick, I'm just going to open it. There's our door not locked, right on the anti-skid as well. So it can be easy to miss if you're not careful, but you definitely want to make sure that door is locked. So door is locked. All right, so now we're ready to start engines. Now, I know in the Coronado version of the Citation 2, there are a couple limitations that aren't exactly representative of the real aircraft. I'll do my best to highlight those and show you guys how we just kind of work around it in the sim. But for starting engines, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Starting the engines in the Citation 2 is very easy, and it's really a lot of fun because it's so easy. And you can see here on the starting engines checklist, basically, first engine, start. That's all we got to do. So what we want to make sure, we're going to turn our battery power on. We are going to do a GPU start. So in the Coronado version, to make sure that we have the GPU connected, go ahead and select right-hand generator and turn that on. When you turn that on, you should see 28 volts here. Now you know if I go ahead and remove ground power unit, it goes back down to 24 volt DC. So in the Coronado version, this is how we verify that the GPU is connected. We'll go ahead and turn that generator offline, and we'll go ahead and start engines. So we know we don't need to turn on the ignitions or the fuel pumps. They're all automatic. So let's go ahead and press the right engine start. There comes 8%. Throttle latch up. Engine 2 idle cutoff. We're waiting for our starter cutout at 39%. There's 39. There's our starter cutout. N1 is on the rise. ITT rollback. Now, in the real airplane, N2 turbine would stabilize right around 49 to 50%. In X-plane, what I'm told for Coronado says that they can't really model the differences between the N2 and the N1, or else they'd have to rework the whole engine model. So for the Coronado version, your engine is considered stable when you have an N2 RPM at about 71.8. All right. After first engine is above 8%, flat out, IT monitor within limits, everything has been verified, and second start, we're going to do the same thing for the second engine. So remember, we are going to disconnect the GPU because we don't want our ground crew have to go under there when that engine's running. So I'm going to go ahead and go right generator online. Now we'll come over here and we'll go disconnect ground power. But now we are sitting on right generator and we're ready to start engine number 1. So same process, left engine start. Turbine on the rise, 8%, throttle latch lift. Throttle comes up and over the gate, back to the idle position, flight idle position. N1 fan begins to turn. ITT rise. Here comes our cutout. 39%, that's modeled very well. 39% starter is cut out. ITT begins to roll back. And again, we're looking for a stabilized engine, 71.8 approximately, N2 for the X-plane version. All right, 71.57, that looks stable to me. We'll go right-hand generator on. AC power and avionics power can come on. So we've completed our starting engine checklist. At this point, let's go ahead and get the airplane ready to move with the B4 taxi. GPU has been disconnected. Verify. Generator switches, they're in the gen position. Volts and amps, checked. So come down here, how we check our volts and amps. Check the left-hand side, 28 volts. Right-hand side, 28 volts. Battery, fully charged, 24, looking good. No excess load, DC amps look good across the board. AC power and master avionics are on. Passenger safety light goes to safety mode. Cabin pressure, temperature controls set and auto. We'll come over to pressurization controls. We're going to be cruising the aircraft at about 30,000 feet, so that looks good there. I'm going to go ahead and leave that into auto position. I'm going to put flow distribution into the cabin. And then if you want to, we can go ahead and turn the fan on and the EVAPs into low, or however you want to set the air conditioning. Air conditioning, or gyro pressure, checked. So we'll come over here. Where's our gyro pressure? Make sure it is in the green band. It's in the green band down there, a little hard to see from the captain's seat. Air conditioning, fan are off. We have it on fan. Anti-skid can come on right now before we taxi the aircraft. Anti-skid is on. Lights out. Inverters checked, so we're going to trip both inverters offline to make sure that they work. So I'm going to move the inverter switch over here to the up position. You can see it tripped, reset, and I'll go ahead and move it to the down position. Inverter 2 fail, trip, and reset. So inverters are working. Belts and harnesses fastened, exterior lights as required. For taxi checklist complete. So we go ahead and skip pages and head over to the taxi checklist. So at this point, aircraft is fired up and we're ready to get on the move. Now, normally you're gonna taxi out with your pitot heats in the off position. You're not gonna get to that until the lineup or takeoff item. So all you're looking for here on your warning panel is that one message, and that should be ready to go. All right, so now that the aircraft start has been completed, at this point, ideally, you would want to get the aircraft rolling and do the taxi checks on the roll. Now, as you do this more and more, and you do each flight doing the taxi checklist, you're going to get more and more comfortable with it. You'll be able to get it down on the roll. But for the first time, we're going to go through it together here at a stationary position. So let's go ahead and run through our taxi checklist. Transponder set as required. So we'll come over here, turn our transponder on. We're going to just squawk 2000. That works for now. Brakes and steering, check left, check right. We would make sure we, check our rudder pedals there. It's kind of hard to do when you're stationary. Flight controls, tops check, bottom check, make sure you are free and correct. All right, flaps, check operation, flap panel agrees with flap position. So this is the actual flap position here, this little white knob, and this is our handle. So we're gonna select flap 7, takeoff, and you can see the position of the flaps matches the handle. That checks flaps in the takeoff position. Autopilot flight director, check heading and altitude set. So we go ahead and this is when we would set our heading to whatever it may be. If you want to take off with the flight director, we'll get into that a little bit later. I'm going to leave the flight director off at this point. Anti-ice, de-ice, checked as required. Right now everything is off. That is checked. Thrust reversers, check. This is something we're going to want to check on the taxi roll. But essentially what we're doing with the thrust reverser check is we need to check the emergency stow capability of the thrust reversers. Alright, so let's talk a little bit about the Citation 550 thrust reverser system and why it's important to do this thrust reverser check. Now, we can go really into detail about the thrust reverser operation, but for X-Plane purposes, I'm going to try to keep it simple, but I still want you to understand the key concepts of these thrust reversers. So, what is the thrust reverser? The TRs are of the external target type employing two vertically oriented doors, or commonly referred to as buckets, which when deployed direct exhaust gases forward to provide a deceleration force for ground braking. When the thrust reversers, or buckets, are stowed, the reversers fare into external airplane contours to form the aft portion of the nacelle. The reversers are mounted to the engine fan nozzle through an aluminum support casting and 4 interconnecting links per door. Also where you can bump your head when you're loading that main cargo door like we talked about in episode 1. Now, normal operation of the thrust reverser system is designed for 2-position operation, stowed during takeoff and flight and deployed during the landing ground roll. Reversers are activated by a pilot operation of the thrust reverser throttle levers and deployed by hydraulic pressure supplied by an engine-driven pump and directed to the drive actuator. All right, so now why am I telling you all this and what does that mean? Well, I want you to take away 2 parts from this discussion. I want you to understand, 1, that the thrust reverser is electrically activated, but hydraulically actuated. So that means that when I move the throttle levers or the reverse levers to the deploy position, this electrically opens the isolation valve, which moves the reverser control to deploy and pressurizes the airplane hydraulic system. The isolation valve allows the airplane hydraulics to now pressurize the thrust reverser system. It is now that the amber arm light will indicate hydraulic pressure to reverser control valve as sensed by a pressure switch. Continuing with the process now, during thrust reverser deployment, the initial movement of the actuator activates the unlocked switches. Either switch will cause the amber unlock light to illuminate. Further movement of the actuator unlocks the reverser through the overcenter linkage. The remaining travel of the actuator will deploy the reverser doors. At full deployment of a thrust reverser, the deploy switch is activated, which will illuminate the white deploy light, which is seen here on our forward cockpit panel. The purpose of the lockout cam is to prevent increasing engine thrust once reverser deployment has been selected until the reverser have been fully deployed. Now, this isn't exactly simulated in the Coronado 550 Citation. The way that this works in X-Plane is that you deploy the thrust reversers by a command, and then you have to increase your thrust levers to get reverse thrust. That's not necessarily true. In the real airplane, you would move the reverser levers up to initiate the actuation and get the buckets to deploy. And then as you further pulled back on those reverse levers, you would be increasing reverse thrust. All right, now that we've gone into discussion of what's actually happening behind the scenes here when you select reverse thrust, now we can understand what we're actually checking during the taxi out and the thrust reverser check. First thing we're checking is that the deploy light shall illuminate in less than 1.5 seconds after the hydraulic unlock light illuminates. Any erroneous sequencing or delay in the illumination of the thrust reverser lights indicate a failure in the thrust reverser system. Either or both conditions requires a maintenance check, and basically it's a no-go item. Secondly, we need to check the emergency stow operation. There is an emergency stow switch for each thrust reverser located on either side of the cockpit glare shield. The emergency stow switch receives its electrical power through the opposite thrust reverser circuit breaker. The emergency stow function can be checked on the ground by deploying the reversers normally and then actuating each emergency stow switch. The deploy and unlock lights shall extinguish. Now, in the real aircraft, the deploy and unlock lights will extinguish. However, the arm and hydraulic pressure on light will remain illuminated. In the Coronado version here in X-Plane, it's going to basically just stow your thrust reverser command by switching the throttle commands back down. So it's just kind of a workaround for X-Plane. So, how we do a proper thrust reverser check. This is something that you would want to do when you're on the move. I highly recommend a ground speed of about 10 to 15 knots before you do this check, or else you really slow down, and if you're taxiing a line of people, they may not like that. So what we'll do it here stationary. What you're going to do to test the thrust reversers is you're going to go ahead and pop the buckets. You're going to verify that the arm, unlock, and deploy lights come on for both engine respectively, and then we're going to emergency stow them. You can see when I placed the emergency stow switches into the stow position, it automatically stows the thrust reversers. Now, in X-Plane, what happens is it just kind of reverses the thrust reverser command here on the throttle quadrant. In real life, it doesn't quite happen that way, but for X-Plane purposes, that's how we're going to check him. And then you want to make sure you turn your switches back to the normal position, and your throttles will work accordingly. So again, pop the buckets, verify the lights deploy, emergency stow, and then go ahead and turn them back to the normal position. Our thrust reversers are now considered checked. Flight instruments checked, verify across the board, your altimeter is set, altitude selector is set, heading, all that good stuff. Radios, avionics set, and go ahead and check all that. Make sure your radios are set for departure. Fuel quantity, balance, check. Come over here, check your fuel quantities. Looks like we got 1,500 aside, balanced perfectly. Pressure selector, check left hand, check right hand, and norm. So another way, so how we would check this, we'd go ahead and move the selector source to left hand, right hand, and then back to normal. Speed brakes, check retracted. So pop the speed brakes. We're going to get a speed brake extend message here on the warning panel. And then we want to go ahead and stow the speed brakes. The light should go out. And again, you can also visually ID that the speed brakes are extending from the cockpit. Make sure that they work as intended. Speed brakes are checked. Flaps set 7 degrees, check. Trim wheels, verify. You have 3 trim wheels. We've got our main trim here, and then we've got roll and rudder trim on the bottom of the console here. So for takeoff, you guys are going to learn over time the best spot that you like to set your trim wheel for takeoff, and it'll vary on weight. Me, personally, I like to put the takeoff trim right on the forward limit there of the trim wheel. Now, that can depend on load and atmospheric conditions and things like that, but personally, I find that it's a little bit better there towards the front end. Now, if you go ahead and set it right in the middle, that's fine. If you set it all the way towards the back, there's a possibility you may start to get a little bit of early rotation with your airplane if you're not using a little forward pressure on the yoke. And once you become airborne, the aircraft is going to climb pretty darn steeply. We got those big, very aerodynamic, very efficient wings out there, a straight wing Citation, so it will climb pretty rapidly. So I like to go ahead and just put it towards the forward limit of that takeoff mark there, so we don't have a super aggressive climb out initially. Now, if you do want a super aggressive climb out because of terrain or something, then of course you're going to want to set that a little bit further aft. Your other trim wheels are going to be located here down here on the center console. You want to make sure that they are all neutral, 1 and 2. That is your roll trim and rudder trim, respectively. Takeoff data, bugs review. So in the aircraft I flew, we actually had a V-speed input that you can put all your V-speeds here on the digital airspeed scale. For the Citation 2, we cannot do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and set 180 knots for climb out. Depending on what you want, what you're after, if you've got terrain or something, 180 knots is going to give you a nice steep climb out. It's going to be pretty efficient. If you're not really worried about terrain at all, 200 is fine. Heck, you can even go up to 205, 210, and you'll have a pretty shallow climb rate at that point. But the best rate of climb, kind of a VX climb out, is going to be right around that 180 knots or so. It's really going to give you a good balance between altitude and speed coming out of a departure. All right, crew briefing is complete. Taxi checklist complete. At this point, the aircraft is ready to taxi. The last thing that we want to do is get our taxi light on. Now, when you come down here and you look at your lighting panel, you're going to find that you have no taxi light. So what we used to do is just use the recog, which are in the wingtips, as a pseudo taxi light. So I go ahead and use the recog lights as taxi lights, parking brake released, and we'll go ahead and get the aircraft taxiing to the runway. Airplane handles really well on the ground. Make sure you watch your wingtips there. You come out of the hangar, you don't want to hit any rental cars or customer cars. It's a very likely possibility, especially when you start flying around Part 91 with corporate owners and they might have a fancy airport home or something like that. Just don't taxi into anybody's car. It's really embarrassing. Now, ideally, this taxi checklist would already be accomplished by a flow pattern, and then the first officer would go ahead and read the items on the checklist, and you'd be verifying that they have all been completed. All right, once we're straight on the taxiway there, let's go ahead and do our thrust reverser checks again. So I get my speed up a little bit. Remember, your ground speed is here on that lower universal, right about 10 knots or so. Let's go ahead and pop the buckets, emergency stow, and then back to normal. Speed brakes, test, extend, retract. Flight controls free and correct. Looking good. Alright, as we get ready to roll up to the runway, it's always good. I always thought it was better for the passengers if they just felt that one continuous motion. We don't have to hold or anything. Now, if there's traffic on the runway, of course, you're going to hold short. But if we can get all our checklist items done, we can roll right onto the runway. It's even better. So before takeoff, this is the point where we are going to go ahead and turn those igniters into the on position. Anti-ice, de-ice as required. You're always going to turn your pitot heats on, so you get rid of that warning message. The rest of your anti-ice, de-ice will be as required. But you want to make sure that all lights are out before entering the runway. So anti-ice, de-ice as required and set. Pitot static heat is on. Double checking that we did turn it on. Exterior lights on. Go ahead and turn our landing lights on. Strobe lights. Put the rest of our lights on. As we take the runway here, transponder, TCAS, TARA, and on, checked. Engine instruments, make sure everything's in the green and looking normal. Annunciator panel, no lights. Departure runway, bugs aligned before takeoff, checklist complete. So as I roll out of the turn here, you want to verify that your runway matches your compass heading so you are on the proper runway, facing the proper direction. I'll resync my heading bug, and we are ready for departure. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'll catch you on episode 3 when we finally get this bird airborne.